Don't send me out to talk.
I'm going to pause it. So, hello, media ethics folks. This is Dr. G, and I'm here with an esteemed Professor Emeritus from the University of Hawaii. I'm going to let him introduce himself and his credentials, but I will say because I think you're so humble, Puakea, that you're not going to say this, but that he was extraordinarily important as a pioneer in terms of having Hawaiian studies at the University of Hawaii, or moving it forward. You could correct me if you think that that's any kind of
And I will. Actually, Hawaiian studies and Hawaiian language are almost two different realms, and I was in Hawaiian language, and so that's been my focus. I taught for 35 years at the university, retired 5 years ago, and I'm the director of a nonprofit called Aweaulu, where I train translators to handle historical materials. That's what I'm doing now.
Okay, thank you. Yeah, we were just talking about, and it's going to become germane to the discussion in a moment, but the idea of the unknown unknowns, the things that you don't know, and I just kind of illustrated that point with my, the two sentence description of Puakea. But it's Puakea Nogelmeier, and I'm going to talk to him about connections between coverage of how should we frame this, Puakea, between TMT, the AMOS STAR controversy with the telescopes on Maui, and Kahoʻolawe, the early 70s or mid 70s
the notion of protesting and where that goes. Can we also clarify that I am not a journalist? I was a language teacher and do history and culture and literature and things. So they do overlap, but there you have. I'm not a journalist.
That's right, but you are given your breadth of knowledge, a very keen observer in the way the press, and you've also been around long enough that you have some immediate experience or witness to, I don't know if were you in Hawaii, and what was this, 76 at Kahoʻolawe, the whole Kahoʻolawe situation?
I actually was the translator for the deed when the United States government gave Kahoʻolawe back.
Wow.
It was a 7-page document that had to be done in English and Hawaiian. So I produced that document in Hawaiian.
Yeah.
So yeah, I was rounded about.
So Puakea has really knows a lot about not just the coverage that unfolded in all three things that we're talking about, but he has the contextual knowledge to be able to evaluate it. And so that's and we're going to talk about, obviously, the ethical dilemmas so that you all can write a case study. We're going to try and frame and explain where there are ethical dilemmas that presented themselves in this coverage. And then we'll let you all weigh in on, taking a position and defending it, and explaining your position. So with that in mind, Puakea, can you start by explaining where you think there are really critical choices that have an ethical dimension in the TMT coverage in the past and, up until today?
Well, TNT coverage covered, years, right? And it made it around the world, by the way. So, I mean, that was a huge impact of that protest and whatnot. So, the 30-meter telescope was the issue and against it and whatnot. But that actually it was seen as sort of a tipping point of issues of who has control over what and where. And so the sort of background behind that got lost in the confrontation for much of the coverage. Much of it just covered exactly what's happening, who's on the ground, what is the government's response, what is the scientific or the owners of the telescope. There's a lot of money involved in that. That was getting perhaps more coverage than larger issues that motivated people to go up and be on the mountain, who saw this as sort of an historical cumulative set of actions where the forces that were making choices weren't even connected to here or to local or to Hawaiian or to the history of this place. So that was, I think, a piece that got addressed piecemeal in some ways, but it affected even what the protesters were said to be presenting and what the scientific community or the control over the land and access were said to be presenting. So it's not that it was completely missed, but I think that it was rarely included in the general coverage. So it came down to Sacred Mountain, and what is sacred. And anti-science, by the way. Anti-science became a huge, modernity in science. And neither of those were necessarily true.
Or a fair representation of.
Yeah, it's much more complicated. And
right. And I think what you're saying there is that there's a lot of history behind the case that was being made in the protests. And that's a big thing that would, be folded into the issue itself, that journalists would be challenged to, first of all, learn themselves on deadline, and second of all, to be able to, transmit to the publics in a way that they understood this stuff.
And whether they could really learn that, because there's a huge history behind this. And, Hawaiians are actually, Polynesians, they're a wildly scientific bunch. So why are they protesting against science and technology? Well, there's background. Whether they can learn that or whether they can simply point to there are elements that should be considered here that are obviously affecting what we're seeing on the ground.
And I think we had some preliminary, before we started the recording, some conversation about what we were going to cover. And I don't want to misrepresent what you're saying, but I think we agreed that the ethical dilemma, one of the big ones we saw, was reporters have to track breaking news. So the book refers to covering events, right? Our media ethics book. And in this sense, it's very much on point, that journalists cover events. And so journalists are confronted with deadlines, and events are unfolding often very fast in a situation like TMT. And also there's a lot of press when a major thing happens, like a protest like that. And so you have a lot of reports coming out all at once. And so the ethical dilemma, is between getting the whole story or getting the story right, and, getting the accurate, factual unfolding of events right. And just to give the latter its fair due, if you're reporting the news, you can't neglect the news, right? So we can say, they need to give a complete history here. Well, a lot of these reporters are coming right into the scene without knowing any history. And so I suppose we could oversimplify and say we're talking about just which choice is better, history or cover the news, but it's never that simple. And so maybe the way to consider this dilemma is, for me to pose to you, and I'll put this in the text as a question for you to address, is if you're either a reporter on the scene coming in, knowing, with full humility, the little you know now, right now, and you were suddenly thrown into this unfolding situation, or if you were a news director, in other words, if you were an editor or you were a producer at a television station and directing the coverage, how do you, maybe a better way than just kind of saying, oh, I'd go this way or I go that way, like I go for history and I wouldn't go for breaking news, is more to say how, the dilemma is like, how do you prepare for that or do that coverage? Like, how would you organize either yourself as a journalist or your team to deal with a challenge like that? Am I leaving any? I mean, you want to elaborate on that?
No, you're being very clear, and I think that at an event that calls for reporting, it's happening. To be able to describe that and get the parameters of that very clearly, that's what you're required to do on the spot. and to even acknowledge that this is in some larger context that we might not fully understand right now, or that I want to learn more about. It sort of balances out that you are clearly reporting what's in front of you and acknowledging that this isn't, without purpose, cause, impetus, that there are factors here that we'll continue to report on, and to build that in as can. They're not all historical. They might be, what was happening on Mauna Kea, there were probably 20 different sort of mindsets that were driving, but it became a unity of protest. But there were different motivations, different worldviews that were involved, and how those were interacting is almost its own story. There are elements of that. There were certainly elements on the TMT side of it. There's commercial, there's a lot of money to be made there. There's, the sort of enforcement of control over who gets to decide what and where, that's in place and could be changed if things got too flexible. There's a history on that side as well. So, and different motivations, and that's not all unified, but that's probably beyond the initial reporting, unless you really go in terribly well informed.
Well, one of the things is, and this would be a good juncture to point it out, and then I'm going to follow up with a question for you about where you see connections with Kahoʻolawe, right? But one of the issues that that's really interesting to me about this is because I was both a journalist and I've published history. I'm a history scholar now, right? And so a lot of times, like the debate we're describing, the ethical debate we're describing in journalism, has a very parallel thing going on among historians of Hawaiian history, right? As I understand, as I've kind of seen from both having you and in my classes at times as a guest, and having Noe Silva, who's author of Aloha Betrayed, that these are two very different perspectives on Hawaiian history. And what I notice, and I don't want to misrepresent you, Puakea, so you could correct me, but I see you always pushing for deeper complexity. And I see Noe Silva with a very strong voice about this is right and this is wrong. And if we look at the history in this way, we see a grave injustice that has been buried and hasn't been brought to light. And, that's where you get into an argument, because, she would be saying maybe, and I don't want to put words in her mouth, but just for the sake of trying to explain this, she would be saying that to someone from Puakea's perspective of, you keep turning this into a bigger complex thing and you're missing the really salient points, right? Yeah. And so there's that echo to like what because you could argue on the one hand that when journalists go off to cover something like TMT, this is the reason why we're presenting this as an ethical case, is because it is a uniquely complex and nuanced subject. We could counter that by saying, no, this is a story about really serious injustice, and this needs some really clear journalism that delineates between what's right and wrong here, and where injustice is being committed. Yeah. Am I right about that?
Yes, and you could actually gear it to multiple perspectives like that. It could be environmentally unjust, it could be historically unjust. I mean, there's different angles through which you could take it. So, but right. The notion of being able to making it more complex, you're right, that's mostly what I aim for. I mentioned before the 25 years ago, we started to unpack. It turned out there was 1.5 million pages of material written in Hawaiian that hadn't been looked at for 100 years. And everything that you learned about Hawaii came from, there's 2% of it that had been translated out and brought into English. And everything else you looked at were the English records. And it's not that they were incorrect, but they were simply insufficient. So I coined a thing called the discourse of sufficiency, where this little pocket of what was called Hawaiian knowledge was enough. If you used that, everything else made sense, and you could analyze and interpret, and the history of these islands. So we call on knowing that there is more beyond what you have in hand is already a great step to take. Just knowing where some of your blind spots are. So being able to address that there might be issues here that I can't touch.
Well, you know what? We should mention something you kind of got through quickly there, which is these pages are what? These are newspapers, overwhelming.
For the most part, it's newspapers, and it was public discourse. A lot of it is also archival record, but the newspapers are the hugest block of that.
Right. So
in Hawaiian language.
So particularly relevant to you folks being journalism students, and journalism history is actually what I do. I don't do, my main area of study isn't media ethics or anything else. It's media history. And so the journalism history is extraordinarily interesting to me about these Hawaiian newspapers and trying to.
Oh, there's really a lot. And journalists might really revel in this kind of thing. You are welcome to clip this out, but I was going to tell you that if you allow me to share screen,
sure.
I happen to have a newspaper up on my desktop.
Well, you know what? Let's get to the.
We can do that after, but
yeah, let's do that.
I would just say
I want to get to the case study.
Stay on this, because otherwise I do tend to stray.
No, I mean it's perfectly relevant, but I'm also I'm the same way. We got to stay on mission. We're both academics, so it's a challenge for us. Right?
I do want to say, and so in relation to how TMT and Kahoʻolawe were linked, is that both were presented in the beginning as sort of the lunatic fringe who can never be satisfied, but both of them also resonated with a larger set of concerns that had a long background in them, and they both ended up as being huge elements. Issues that got world coverage in effect. So the ethics of, you were speaking before about being aware of within the media that's out there, being aware of what important issues are not being touched, trying to gain a sense of what needs to be brought to the forefront is one of the issues that I think journalists face. Is, am I just echoing what was, in 5 other articles, or am I looking at those articles and seeing what's not been addressed enough, or what I feel should get more coverage?
The holes in the coverage.
Yeah,
the narrative that begins to develop when you have a pack of journalists covering the same story.
And it starts to develop its own almost vocabulary. We continue to discuss immigrants as averse to refugees, and just the terminology that becomes widespread starts to frame how we look at those.
Yeah, that's why we have framing theory in media studies, because of this very problem, right?
Yes.
And I would just say that you really, you nailed it concisely there, but I think what you're saying is that the link between Kahoʻolawe and TMT is that particularly back in the 70s, the journalists weren't unpacking enough of the substance and the history there.
Yeah.
For it eventually broke through, right? But that initial problem, it sounds to me like you're saying, is still with us, and
not having
that's
enough.
what ends up marginalizing the protesters, right?
Yes, and presenting them as sort of the never satisfied, sort of lunatic fringe, and that's where Mauna Kea started, and Kahoʻolawe. You ended up having very high-profile people, stepping in and saying, "I'm here too," So
what about what's going on, now on Maui and AMOS STAR?
Now here's an element that is sort of unfortunate, is that the issue on Mauna Kea with TMT, the sort of dialogue started to be, well, this is the sacred mountain. This is the place. And And so once that's sort of acknowledged or granted, and even if it's patronizing to go, okay. Well, now somebody wants Haleakala, and it's wait a minute. I thought that one was the sacred one. What? How come? What? Every mountaintop is sacred, and so it fuzzes the issue if that's where the direction of the coverage is.
Well, another thing that fuzzes it maybe, and I don't really know, but my understanding is one was much more pure science, right? The situation and on Big Island, whereas with TMT, whereas the other one is the Air Force and what do they call it? The space, Space Army. What is it called? No, Space Force. The Space Force, right? Which everybody was joking about, but it's really the Space Force. It's the military that wants this thing on Maui. So we're conflating a scientific agenda on one island. There's the danger of that, right? Of conflating a scientific endeavor on Big Island with a military endeavor on Maui.
I'm a little fearful of you accepting that Mauna Kea was about science.
Okay.
And that Haleakala is about militarism. I think the underlying thing on both of them is who has the power to make these choices.
Okay.
I don't think that I was telling you that Hawaiians were incredibly scientific and particularly astronomic. They're into astronomy and the notion of being able to, navigate by the stars for a few thousand years. But when the transit of Venus was passing over Hawaii and it was the best of viewing points, the kingdom opened their shores to the world and invited all astronomers to come, you're welcome. There's a real background and support. So that wasn't a rejection of science. There were environmental issues, there were historical issues, but a really big one was the power to make that choice. Who makes the choice and who benefits from it? Because of course, on both sides, but especially on Mauna Kea, Hawaii has been promised from the very first telescope that was put up there. This will improve the economy and education. One of the lowest ranking reading scores in the nation is Mountain View Elementary School, is what I'm told, which is 20 miles from the access road. Why is that promise of 40 years ago still being dangled like a carrot? I know there were a lot of arguments like that going forth, that who is this benefiting? It's not fulfilling the promise that it was saying. And so it wasn't a rejection of science. It was I don't believe at all. And I don't think that Haleakala is simply a rejection of military decision-making. It's the overall piece on who makes decisions here. Who owns that land? Who has the power to say yay or nay? And a military space force does sound a little more nefarious, but the science of Mauna Kea wasn't pure. It's just, there are somebody's making a great deal of money, by the way, now building that telescope.
We just showed them, I think, in real time, Puakea, how you really have to be sensitive to, you have to listen. And you have to ask really, you have to ask a lot of questions, and you have to be focused on what you're doing, because you've just educated me in real time on mistakes I was making without, just out of my ignorance, just out of my lack of knowledge of the situation, where I'm saying, well, can't we, I would walk back to my desk on deadline and start writing this up, and I would be drawing distinctions that you wouldn't agree with, having more context and more knowledge about this. You'd be saying that, you're kind of getting the story wrong, right? And so if it was 5 more minutes with that source, who's knowledgeable, of saying, oh my God, I delay it, but you don't always have 5 minutes.
Of course you don't. And I don't think you are operating on a lack of information. You're probably operating on too much information. That plethora of noise out there did keep presenting Mauna Kea as a straight science element. And yet a whole lot of it has to do with the destruction of historical sites, with access to the mountain, the respect for traditional culture, aquifers that were they were saying might well be, and there were environmental things, is a lot of other elements. It wasn't anti-science, is what I would say.
Yeah, and what you don't want to do is, we keep saying, oh, the complexity and the nuance is so important. What you don't want to do as a journalist is send people into rabbit holes, which frankly, trying to follow the unfolding events of TMT, I felt like every time I picked up the paper, I was falling into a different rabbit hole. So there is a real imperative as a journalist for clarity and for your own thinking, and for then the way you turn it around and package it as coverage, so that people really understand the salient issues. I was just telling Puakea that my history, the stuff I've really covered, was about the Holocaust, and the reason the final solution got lost in the American press when news of the Nazi final solution, in other words, news that the Nazis had organized a train system and gas chambers and crematorium and killing centers, the reason that wasn't on the front pages was because in late 1942, early 43, you had Guadalcanal, you had Stalingrad, you had just this massive hailstorm of news, and so people in real time, Americans in real time, were missing the story of the Holocaust. Part of the nuance here is, like, in that story, is conflating the word Holocaust, which is our historical word, for an actual specific event that was breaking news in late 42, early 43, which is the final solution to the Jewish question. And so, this was one of the great failures of, we could argue, there are lots of great failures, but certainly missing the story of the Holocaust was one of the great failures of the American press in history.
And but you were saying there were individual journalists who saw that this has to be brought to the fore. This has to be, and that's what made it finally reach front page news, right?
Actually, it was activists. It was activists that saw the guy I wrote a biography about, who was a former journalist, but he was writing screenplays and had gotten involved in actual, like, he crossed the Rubicon into actual activism. It was the Holocaust that had caused that to happen, but he was seeing the blind spot. He was seeing the lack of coverage of the final solution, and so he was doing any kind of, he knew publicity, and so he was doing the equivalent of grabbing journalists by their lapels and saying, put this on the front page. This is front page news. You need to cut through the noise and put this in front of the American people, because we are racing against the clock. 4 million people will be dead in a year if you do not, wake up the Roosevelt administration and the allies to the need for rescue.
Yes. And activism is, sort of integrated with journalism, right? It's how to educate a public. Before I lose it, I do want to say taking people into rabbit holes isn't a bad thing, but know your rabbit hole. Because otherwise, simply repeating, of course, what's already on the, the AP or something, that's not really journalism, is it? If you're just echoing the sentiment, rewording it, go ahead, take me into a rabbit hole, but clarify where we're headed and how it ties into the bigger picture. That's probably what illuminates some of these non-covered issues. I'm on the edge of activism myself with a couple of issues that I don't think are being covered sufficiently and not being addressed. And so I'll write letters, I'll talk to people. I may get noisier, we'll see.
Yeah. And I would, my follow-up would be, and what are those, Puakea? But I think we better let the students go, right? Because they're going to see an hour and a half video or something.
Yeah, they just need a bite. Yeah, I'll bite.
But anyway, I wanted to thank you very much. I'm going to have a quick conversation with Puakea if he has a minute, or maybe we'll follow up an email, whatever's more convenient for you. But we will put resources in the, what the podcasters would call the show notes, right? Some links. And good luck with this, you folks. Again, thank you very much. Huge mahalo to you, Puakea, for participating in this. You did this at very last minute notice, and so is, you know, a real scholar and
Be
a
good journalists.
so okay, so thank you guys. I'm gonna pause the recording here, and you and I'll wrap up.